So today isn't a very happy day.
Today's going to be a hard one. So last year we replaced the batteries and we kind of put everything in the position where they were originally.
We took out our old lead acid for bank of batteries and we purchased 2 lithium ion
Rely-on RB100s.
That's what I was trying to remember.
Which we've basically just dropped into place, and it's worked perfectly fine. We've had excellent performance out of them over the year. But when we got it wired in, we knew that it was going to have to come out eventually because the wooden box down there that was put in when the boat was built was kind of rotten. There's a whole bunch of rust underneath it that needs to be treated and painted. And on top of that, what we found out later in the year, thanks to the investigations of Jono and his videos, is that the lithium batteries, although they will discharge very, very well in extremely low temperatures, you want to limit the amount of current going into them when they are below 0 degrees Celsius.
And because we've got solar panels, obviously they do charge at that temperature.
Yeah, although they do not generally put out anywhere near the over 10 amp in the winter that would be required to get into overvoltage. Most of the time when we've been in the engine bay, by the time the batteries are getting any charge greater than 10 amp, they're not below 0 degrees. So it kind of has been fine. There's been no damage to the batteries or anything, but they'd be better off inboard. The electrical connections would be easier to deal with inboard. The whole problem of the rust and everything can be treated more easily.
So yeah, there's just like a number of reasons why it makes sense. And we knew we were going to have to do it, and today we're just going to seize the moment and move it because we're in a pretty good position to do it. When we did install the batteries where they are, it was such a horrible job. Like Michael couldn't barely fit in the engine bay. I could just about fit, so I was doing the connections, and just the thought of going down there and disconnecting everything that we connected is just not...
It's been painful.
And also last time when we were disconnecting the lead acid, we didn't know what any of the cables were, but when we installed them we labelled everything, so we'll know what everything is this time. And we did this beautiful diagram of our system
as it existed. We sort of didn't modify it entirely for the new version, but basically we've got a plan of what our connections were. We have everything labeled, so for the most part it's just breaking all the connections that we made in the proper order. We have to break the connection to the solar panels first so that the solar charger isn't pumping anything into the batteries, then we need to isolate the batteries, and then so on and so forth. Most of the connections are already coming from inside the boat in front of the firewall in front of the engine, so for the most part it'll just be pulling them through carefully. A couple of batteries cables will need to be made up new, which we're going to get from either Bronston Chandlers or Midland Chandlers. We'll figure that out.
So I don't know how much we're actually going to film today, because I imagine that as the day goes on our stress levels will increase and
there'll be a fair bit of swearing,
and
but
the camera
hopefully
won't come out.
Starting to do everything is basically prep, so it's all getting it out of the way. We've done most of that.
Our boat is just upside down.
Yeah, we've got a drawer full of clothing sitting on top of the roof.
Our mattress is on the dinette.
Yeah.
So that whole it's just a nightmare.
So
and all we want to be doing is getting on the boat and cruising, but that's not going to happen today.
And by the end of today, the plan is to have the domestics reattached. The starter won't even be reattached because we have to do all of the rust repair and
if the domestic's not attached, then that means we've got nothing. We've got no water or anything. So I filled up the kettle, I filled up all our glasses with water, and worst case scenario, we can see the Admiral Nelson, so we'll be there for dinner.
The pub right there. Disconnecting the solar panels from the solar controller, and then insulating and making safe the cables with a bit of electrical tape. So you can see it very well, but basically we just turn off all of the indoor electrical connections. Which isolates everything. That's our leisure batteries, that's our starter.
Everything's off.
Now everything's dead. So here's where we need to start making the disconnections, and that's where things are going to get complicated. this is the starter battery, and the charger positive, so the battery charger positive connects to it, and then this was to the starter ISO.
Do you want me to write that down?
Yeah, the battery charger positive. The battery positive is now disconnected on the starter battery, so as long as nothing that's conductive touches both of those terminals together, I'm alive. So that's a good thing. So now I need to break the negative connection, which is the one that's the hardest to see. And it's got the most connections on it. So it looks like what I need to do is disconnect so the negative from the battery is going to the bus bar. So I'm going to disconnect the bus bar up there. So we've got the batteries out and all the connections in here have been broken. Now we basically just need to take all of the cables that currently run from in there to out here, and which are not starter battery connections, because the starter battery is going to remain here and all of its connections are going to remain here, but everything that was connected to the domestic bank has to move inside. And they're all labeled, which is great, but they're also all zip tied together or cable wrapped. And so I need to cut all of that, and we need to sort of remove conduit and pull the cables through so that we can begin the next part, which is drilling all the holes through our cupboards that are going to be the way that the cables move from this position to where the new batteries are going to be. Right, so that was like 3 days ago. So you know when they say that you're supposed to, if you're starting a job, like a task at work or whatever, and a management asks you to estimate how much time it will take, you should always sort of mentally estimate exactly what it would be and then double that. And people say that when you're doing it on boats, maybe you should square it. So my thing is that if you're doing it on narrow boats and it involves the electrics, use at least an exponent of 3, possibly 5. So we set out several days ago to do a one-day job of moving our batteries inboard. We wanted to get the lithiums inboard and keep them warm over the winter. We had another major pressing reason for doing it, which is that the batteries in our boat, the lead acids, had been sitting on a small wooden box that had itself been sitting on top of one of our skin tanks. The batteries, being lead acids, had apparently overheated and overflowed at some point, and some acid had gotten onto the decking of the skin tank back there. So basically, where the wood had gotten sodden through, a very large amount of rust had developed. We're going to treat the rust, remove the rust, treat the rust, paint over the skin tank, and simultaneously it made sense to move the batteries inboard. Well, we'd already gotten all the cables made so that they could make it all the way to the back, through the firewall, across the engine bay, to where the batteries were situated and everything. And if you measure the distances quickly and everything, it looks like, yep, no problem. We can take those cables and just move them underneath the floorboards and then get the batteries into the bed area. We pulled everything apart, disconnected everything, and then rapidly found out that not one of the damn cables would make it all the way to where it needed to go. So now we're going to need to get a bunch of custom cables made up. By the late evening, we'd run out of power in both of our cameras. We'd run out of power in the GoPro. We couldn't record anything else. We, of course, couldn't repower anything. So 3 days later, multiple trips to screw fix, multiple trips to the Chandlers. We've got custom cables made up. We've got everything running back through, and we've got our DC system hooked back up again. The starter motor is still disconnected, the starter battery is disconnected, the alternator is disconnected, so we can't charge anything using the alternator. Thankfully, we've got sun at the moment, and we've got solar, so right now we're finally getting up to some power. And for the first time in 3 or 4 days, we can actually have some hot water. Jo has been doing work in the back, because she's the smaller, more flexible of us, to actually get in and get the rust out. So we're kind of on our way to being able to fur tan today. First coat of bilge paint tomorrow, second coat of bilge paint the next day, and then 4 days from now, essentially, we'll be able to put the battery back in and do the last of the wiring job, which allows us to finally reassemble our bed, which allows us to actually sleep not in the dinette, which is what we've been doing for the last couple of days, which is why neither of us has had any sleep.
Which is why we're in very good moods.
We're in excellent moods. George is in the best mood of all of us because George hasn't had to worry about almost any of this and has just been sitting outside chasing the ball occasionally.
Talking to everyone that goes by.
Yes. So we've had some viewers who've come by and said hi, but we haven't been able to talk to you for very long. Sorry about that. My breakfast is apparently ready. That's good. We'll do a little bit of a show and tell of just how bad the boat is and everything right now to give you an idea of the chaos we've been living in. Okay, so current state of our living area. Notice all the tools for packing and repacking. Toolboxes for painting and everything. And that's where we've been sleeping the last few days. Kitchen, surprisingly, probably the cleanest part of the entire boat. The bedroom, where normally YouTube is not allowed to go. But at this point, you can sort of see what our setup is. The bus bar covers are going to have to get made still, but we're on our way. And then the cover for the bed will go down. Plenty of ventilation under there. And the cables run through underneath in our closet where the inverter is, out the other side to the engine bay. Overall, it's much easier to add connections, remove connections, change connections, get to fuses, get to breakers, etc. Fuse blows or anything, it's much easier to deal with. It'll be warmer in here, obviously during the winter, should be no problems. These nice sealed boxes and everything keep the batteries well and truly protected. They're lithiums, so they don't have any ability to like off gas in a way that is the same sort of problems as with lead acids. Everything we've read, everything we found assures us that this is a perfectly sensible idea, but it has led to an insensible amount of mess. And Joe is now beginning the rust treatment. Okay, Joe, what you doing down there? Yep, that's what she said. Margle for Mark. So, wire brush, a great deal of time. This was all heavily flaked rust. Like, really heavily flaked rust. So basically, Joe has removed all of the rough rust with the steel brush and dusted all of that away. Then degreased all of the surfaces that are going to be fur tanned. At the moment, she's doing a bit of a wet wipe down because the fur tan needs to be moistened. Well, the surface needs to be moistened before the fur tan is applied. Then she's just brushing on fur tan. That's fur tan, not pickle juice. It might look like pickle juice, but that's just the container we're using to hold the fur tan. So JoJo's down there. She's washed off the fur tan today, let everything dry, and now she is starting to brush on the bilge paint and roller on the bilge paint, which is very difficult to get a shot of. And then after 2 coats of bilge paint, which takes about 48 hours, we reconnect all of these little electrical connections down here to the starter battery, which is currently sitting up there, and basically pray. So, repairs day 8, 9, something like that. We rewired all of the domestics a few days ago. That's been up and running, so I don't think there'll be any surprises right now. We have made the connection between the alternator 100 and the ground, so now we're wired up to the starter circuit. The starter circuit's ready to go. Knock wood. And so on. I've already got the battery monitor running up there, so the inverter and solar should just come back on. So the inverter breaker is isolated from everything by the isolation switch over here. The solar breaker allows charge to start going back into the batteries. So we turn that on, and it's still on float because we're at 100%. So what's the battery monitor showing for amps right now, by the way?
1.09 amps.
That brings our 12 volts live. Start flipping the inverter on. And there we go. Inverter's on. Alright, flipping on the lights. Okay, the lights are working. Lastly, the fridge. Okay, so now everything's on except for the nav lights. Now to isolate everything from the surprise that may come in a second, but hopefully won't, we're going to turn everything off again. Domestic circuit is off. So now comes the real moment of truth. Moments of truth. So if I flip on the starter circuit, nothing should go live. The isolator is currently turned off. Okay, bilge pump charger. Charger's not going to do anything. Bilge pump's not going to do anything. Bow thrusters are... Ooh, that's good. Oh, only that's not good. Wait.
Well, nothing happened. No, it did.
That shouldn't be working with this off. How is that working? Oh, it's got its own isolator.
Yeah.
Right, and it's got its own battery. So
Yeah.
I've just told its battery to do its job. Yeah, so this thing can't be getting any. It can't be getting any charge yet.
It's
from
just
here
using
because
its own
the circuit's turned
battery.
on. Yeah. Okay. Whew. Rubber cover off.
Oh, yeah, drop it on the floor.
Well done, Michael. Minor position switch because Joe is considerably smaller than me. So, the key is going to go in, but the key is not going to be rotated. Just putting it in. Okay? Now out. Because these are the moments of truth. So now that you're in a safe position where you will be launched vertically if something goes wrong, you can turn the key. And nothing whatsoever should happen. Nothing whatsoever happened. Excellent. Okay, so the bilge pump should now start working.
Good. I can hear it.
Okay. And this is our true moment of truth. Wait, sure, make sure we're neutral. In neutral.
So we haven't turned our engine on for 8 days.
I haven't turned our engine on for 8 days.
Because we haven't had a starter battery for 8 days.
Fluids are good. Oil's good.
Woo!
What's that?
Let's go!
All right. And now we're charging. What we've got down here is the starters as they're currently set up. So basically the wooden box is gone. We've replaced the battery box with this plastic box that was purchased from Midland Chandler's. Had to cut a couple holes for the connectors going in. We've now got rubber terminal covers on the positive and negative terminal. And then on this wall here, we've got all of the connections that are necessary for the starter battery setup. You can see the various connections we've got, where we've got the positive isolation switch followed by a positive, it's not really a bus bar, it's just sort of a connection block. And then from there we've got the various connections that go to the bow thruster battery positive, this thing called a voltage sensitive relay, that's the gray box there, and a couple of other minor things like the bilge pump and stuff. The rest of it was really just cleaning up all of these cables and making the connection back to the domestics. So now there's 2 large cables that have to come through, one from the alternator positive on the other side of the engine. The only other things that are wired in here are the AC charger for if we ever plug into shore power again, and the bow thruster and its connections. It's pretty simple back here, and it takes up a lot less space. We now have storage for our oils and lubricants and various other things. This is our new complete finished battery setup for the domestic batteries. And what we've got in here is our 2 lithium-ion batteries, which are now properly BOSS compliant in that they have a positive and negative battery terminal rubber cover, plus they're inside boxes which are fixed to the ground. So we have our main bus negative and main bus positive, which are underneath these wooden covers so that the bus is protected from any sort of short happening or anything. There's a bunch of fuses, etc. So we've got the 150 amp fuse on our DC connection. That's our DC 12 volt distribution, so that's the DC for the vote. And on the bus bar we've got the connections for solar, charger, and the battery connection. And then we have a couple of connections going off for minor things like the battery monitor and stuff, and the battery shunt. And then we have the feed going to the isolator, which is the positive isolation for all of the domestics. That goes to the 12 volt distribution, which is a 650 amp, which is overkill, but it was the best bus bar I could find for the size. That allows us to take all the positive off to everything else. So the, well, actually in from everything else. So the, well, sort of both. So everything's labeled. The small ones that go off of here go over there for some fuses. Before heading off to the various switches, these are the ones that are independently fused. And then we've got the negative bus bar under that cover, and that's where all of our ground connections and negative connections go, including one that goes back to the starter battery, which is the big thick one on the left. And then last but not least is that gray box on the right where the very large breakers are for the 375 watt inverter and the solar charger. So it's been a hellish job, but a worthwhile one. We had to move the batteries inboard because they're lithiums and they don't like to be in cold temperatures. We also can move the batteries inboard because they're lithiums. If they weren't lithiums, they could off-gas in ways that are a little bit more disastrous, and so you shouldn't do that. Lithium iron phosphide is very, very, very good. It's nice and what they call inherently stable, so, or sorry, inherently safe. So, barring something truly catastrophic happening and bypassing the battery monitor, it'll be fine. But we also wanted to get rid of the incredible mess of spaghetti that we'd received from the manufacturer and previous owners who had done minor alterations and not labeled anything and often used the same color cable for both positive and negative terminals and things like that. We also wanted to make sure it passed BSS, which it should do. Everything in here should pass BSS to the letter. Lots of extra fuses and stuff that weren't there before, lots of connections that are on the correct side of the connections, and especially the isolator, which they weren't before. Honestly, I'm not sure how this boat passed BSS before, although the BSS has changed a few times. We've also made it so that the boat's better for us. So if we ever have to make any electrical connections again, especially if they're to the domestics, that will be almost trivial. And that will be good for the future owners as well, in case somebody decides to do something crazy like put in, I don't know, a disco ball or a karaoke machine, they will be able to do so. So it's been a long, exhausting job. I got like 2 hours sleep last night. That was primarily George trying to kick me off the dinette table, which is now our bed, which has been our bed for over a week now, which is why I don't have any sleep. I have not had any sleep. The only thing left to do, the only thing we haven't gotten done, is draw up a brand new and complete diagram of the whole circuit, which I'm going to probably laminate and put down here somewhere, so that if anybody ever has to face this nuttiness again, they will know what everything is and where it goes. Hope you found this remotely interesting. I'm glad you made it through this far to the video to see whether or not we got electrocuted. Neither of us did, so that's good. A couple minor injuries, some blood, but not a lot. Not as much footage as we want because you can't keep batteries charged in phones when you can't charge anything. So, hopefully you liked it. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you haven't spotted anything completely and egregiously wrong with what I've done. If you have, keep quiet. Like, comment, and subscribe.
So we set out on 3 days ago now? 4 days ago? 2 days ago.
I've seen you on YouTube.
Thanks. It had apparently overheated and overflown or something. Or overflown. Overflowed.
And we degreased it. Now she's okay.
You know I was going to say, where?
Yeah. Vertan itself smells more like Worcestershire sauce or Worcester sauce, depending on which country you're from, or sort of a steak sauce type smell. Somewhat appetizing to the non-vegetarians among us.
Probably already know, and you've probably been already told, that you've got your navigation lights on.
Oh, we're just doing our electrics. We've literally just switched them on.
Good luck.
Thank you.
We switched the domestics. Wait a second. George, what are you doing? What the heck are you doing? He's on somebody else's boat and he's messing around in somebody's bowls or something. We're just going through and moving the domestics. That wasn't that hard, so well, I say that wasn't that hard. That was its own job, but